1,500! Who made those 3,500,000?
After reviewing the evidence before this court and the certified documents presented, it is the ruling of this court that Eliza Monroe is and has always been a free woman.
In October of 1852, in the state of California, a state whose own constitution had declared slavery illegal just 2 years earlier, a woman was sold at public auction for $1,400. It was the highest price ever paid for an enslaved person at public auction in California history. The men who bid against each other did not know they were committing a crime. They did not know that the woman standing on that platform, perfectly still, perfectly composed, watching them with eyes that gave away nothing, was not enslaved, had never been enslaved, had been a legally certified free woman for 8 years before that auction even began. And they had no idea, none of them, not the auctioneer, not the buyer, not the judge standing at the back of the crowd, about what was sewn into the hem of the dress she was wearing at that very moment. A document, rolled in waxed linen, stitched in with black thread, invisible to every eye in that crowd, the legal proof of her freedom, carried 2,000 miles across a continent, through chains, through desert, over a mountain range. She had not been captured. She had been waiting. This is the story of Eliza Monroe, the most expensive, most dangerous, and most deliberately misunderstood woman ever auctioned in the state of California. And by the time this story is over, you will understand something that the men on that platform never did. She walked onto that auction block already knowing how she was going to destroy them. Before we go any further, before we talk about what was in that dress and how it got there, I need you to do something right now. Subscribe to Unmarked History and turn on every notification. Because this channel exists for one reason: to find the cases that were sealed, the documents that were burned, the people who were deliberately written out of the record, and bring them back into the light. Eliza Monroe's story survived by the thinnest thread imaginable. A document in a notary's register that nobody thought to destroy because nobody thought anyone would ever look for it. This channel looks for it. Every single video. Subscribe now so you don't miss what comes next. And then leave a comment. Tell me what city, what country, what part of the world you're watching from. These stories were meant to travel. I want to know how far they're reaching. Now, let's talk about the man who made all of this possible, before Eliza Monroe was born. You cannot understand what happened in Sacramento in 1852 without first understanding a man who was never in Sacramento, who never saw California, who died, as far as the records tell us, in Ohio, a free man, a carpenter with no monument and no street bearing his name. His name was Daniel Monroe. And what he built, not with wood, not with his hands, but with time and language and deliberate, patient instruction, was the architecture of his daughter's survival. Charlottesville, Virginia, 1836. Daniel Monroe was a free black man in a state that considered his freedom a technicality to be maintained through constant documentation. In antebellum Virginia, a free black person carried their papers the way other people carried their breath. Not because they wanted to, but because without it, they did not fully exist in the eyes of the law. He had watched men taken. Men whose papers were challenged by someone with a badge and an interest. Men who disappeared into the system and were never seen again. He understood, with the clarity that only experience can produce, that freedom in America was not a condition. It was a performance. And a performance required props. The most important prop was paper. He had a daughter named Eliza. She was 8 years old. From the time she was old enough to sit still, Daniel Monroe taught her to read. Not novels. Not scripture, though there was scripture. He taught her to read documents, deeds, legal filings, sale records, court testimonies. He taught her to look at a piece of paper and understand not just what it said but what made it valid, what gave it authority, what could be challenged, what was permanent, what was fragile. And he told her something that she carried for the rest of her life. The day may come when they take the papers. Your job, before that day comes, is to make sure the papers survive. Eliza's mother Grace was enslaved on the Hargrove plantation, 2 miles outside town. Eliza visited Sundays. She watched her mother move through a world that owned her, with an extraordinary economy of self, spending nothing that was not absolutely necessary, preserving some untouchable interior space that the plantation could reach toward but never fully close its hand around. She was learning from both of them. Her father taught her the law. Her mother taught her how to survive inside a system designed to erase you, through stillness, through patience, through the strategic management of what you let the world see. She absorbed both lessons completely. In 1843, when Eliza was 15, Daniel Monroe purchased his wife's freedom. It had taken him 11 years to save the amount required. He paid it in cash in the office of the Hargrove family attorney without ceremony. He walked out with Grace Monroe on his arm and a deed of manumission in his coat pocket. The following year, Eliza's own freedom was formally established. The Hargrove heir signed the papers. Eliza Monroe, at 16 years old, was legally free. She received the document. She read every word of it, not with relief, not with tears, but with the analytical attention her father had spent years cultivating. She noted what it established. She noted what it did not say. She noted what would need to happen to protect it. Then she began, quietly and methodically, to plan for the day someone tried to take it. Stay with me. Because that plan, the one she started building at 16 years old, is what she's going to use on an auction platform in California 8 years later. And the way she executes it is extraordinary. New Orleans, Louisiana. January 9, 1849. The Monroe family had relocated to New Orleans in 1845. The city was the most complex racial environment in the American South, a place where free people of color had existed for generations in a recognized, if perpetually precarious, social stratum. They owned property. They operated businesses. They worshipped in their own churches. And across those generations, they had developed a survival strategy that the white power structure consistently underestimated. Register everything. File it twice. Keep a copy where no one will look. On January 9th, Eliza Monroe walked up the stairs of a narrow building on Chartres Street in the French Quarter and entered the office of the notary public Antoine Marcelin. She was 21 years old. She was accompanied by a white attorney named James Claiborne, whose presence was required because the law had not yet decided to take her word about her own existence without a white co-signature. Marcelin examined her Virginia manumission papers. He verified the county seal, the signatures, the legal language. He asked his questions carefully. And then he opened his notarial register and, in the precise looping script of a man who believed in the permanence of what he recorded, he certified the free status of Eliza Monroe. Signed. Witnessed. Dated January 9, 1849. Filed in the official records of Orleans Parish. He handed Eliza her certified copy. She thanked him. She walked back down the stairs onto Chartres Street. She went home. She opened her wardrobe. She took out the dark wool dress that had been hanging there since autumn. She went to her sewing kit. And then she did something that, if you have been paying attention, you already understand. She rolled the certified copy of her registration into a waxed linen sleeve. The wax to protect against moisture. The linen to prevent the paper from fraying with movement. She pressed it flat, worked it into the inner fold of the hem, and stitched it in small, tight, uniform stitches in black thread that matched the fabric precisely. The kind of stitching designed to survive months of wear, designed to survive a search conducted by someone who was looking for a hidden document but did not know exactly what they were looking for. She put the dress on. She stood at her mirror. She was 21 years old. She was a legally certified free woman. And she had just created, with a needle and thread and her father's voice in her memory, the weapon that would unmake everyone who tried to claim her. She wore that dress for 2 years. She was wearing it the day Harlan Foss came through her door. Now, I need you to understand who Harlan Foss was. Because what he did to Eliza Monroe, and how completely he misunderstood what he was doing, is the center of this entire story. Keep watching. Harlan Foss was not a monster in the theatrical sense. This matters. The theatrical monster, the one who announces his evil, is easy to identify and easy to defeat. Harlan Foss was something far more dangerous. He was a professional. He operated out of a rented office on Poydras Street in New Orleans, and he specialized in what his correspondents called westward transfers, the movement of enslaved people from the older southern states into the newer, legally uncertain territories of the American West. He was meticulous, organized, and almost entirely without imagination. This was precisely what made him dangerous. Imagination might have led him to ask the right questions. The absence of imagination led him to ask only the questions his method required. He had studied California with the cold attention of a man who profits from legal contradictions. California had entered the Union as a free state, yes, But in April of 1852, the California legislature had passed a Fugitive Slave Act, establishing that any black person who had entered California before statehood could be arrested, detained, and returned south as a slave. No jury trial. No right to contest. A commissioner hearing, sometimes lasting less than an hour, could determine a human being's legal status for the rest of their life. And one provision that made everything else possible. A black person in California could not testify in court against a white person. Whatever a black woman knew about her own freedom, she could not speak it in a courtroom that mattered. Foss understood this with the precision of a man whose entire business model depended on it. He found Eliza Monroe's name through a clerk in the office of a failed cotton merchant whose estate was being liquidated. He conducted due diligence. He visited the neighborhood, spoke to neighbors, assessed the documentation landscape. He found a woman living alone, her parents recently relocated to Cincinnati, her community ties thinned. He found a notarial office that had lost portions of its register, through fire and bureaucratic disarray, from the period 1847 through 1850. He did not find the January 1849 entry, because he did not look for it. He looked for vulnerability. He did not look for the absence of vulnerability. He had succeeded so many times through this method that he had confused his method with thoroughness. He had never had cause to ask whether the person across from him was conducting her own investigation of him. In September of 1851, Foss presented fraudulent documentation to a Louisiana magistrate identifying Eliza Monroe as enslaved property. The paperwork was manufactured carefully. The signatures were plausible. The dates were consistent. The magistrate reviewed the papers for 11 minutes. He signed the authorization. Eliza Monroe was taken from her rooms on Baron Street on a Tuesday afternoon. She was given no opportunity to speak. No opportunity to show her papers. Under every operational assumption of every official involved, she had no legal voice with which to contest what was being done to her. She was shackled. She said nothing. She was placed in a holding facility. Transported north by river to Memphis. Overland by wagon through Missouri. West across the Great Plains and through the Mojave Desert and over the Sierra Nevada mountains in the late summer heat. 2,000 miles. And sewn into the hem of the dress they had never thought to change off her body, because she was property in their eyes, and property doesn't need its clothes changed, was the document that made every mile of that journey an act of strategic patience rather than defeat. She was not being transported to California. She was transporting herself. Here is what I need you to understand. Eliza Monroe never lost control of this situation. Not for a single day. What looks like captivity from the outside, what looks like the system winning, was something else entirely. Stay with me. Because what she does in Sacramento is the payoff of everything her father taught her. Everything. Let us be precise about what California was in October of 1852. It was a state that had declared slavery illegal in its constitution while passing a law 8 months earlier that made the enslavement of black people functionally possible through procedure. It was a city still bearing the scorch marks of a fire that had consumed much of its downtown the previous year. It was a place full of men who had come from every direction on earth to find gold, and who had brought with them every assumption about race and law and property that they had arrived in this country holding. The crowd that gathered outside Gerald Whitmore's commission house on J Street that October morning was not a mob. These were Sacramento's respectable men. Mine operators. Merchants. A county commissioner. A sitting judge who stood at the back of the crowd with his arms folded. Men who believed, with the comfortable certainty of people whose assumptions have never been seriously challenged, that what they were participating in was a legitimate commercial transaction. The auctioneer's name was Claude Beaumont. He wore a hat too large for his head, and he had the speaking cadence of a man who has learned to make the obscene sound ordinary. The advance notice in the Sacramento Union had called Eliza a woman of singular refinement, educated in household management to a degree rarely encountered. That word, educated, was worth $50 in the bidding alone. At 9 o'clock in the morning, Eliza Monroe was brought through the front door of Whitmore's commission house and onto the platform. She wore the dark wool dress. Her hands were unbound. She walked to the platform with a specific kind of stillness. Not the stillness of defeat, but the stillness of a woman who has decided exactly how much she is going to let the world see. She looked at the assembled men the way you look at a problem you have already solved. Not with contempt. Not with fear. with the patient, quiet authority of someone who knows something that everyone else in the room does not. None of them could read it. None of them knew what they were seeing. The bidding opened at $200, $800, $1,000, $1,400. The hammer fell. The buyer was Preston Calloway, Georgia-born, 48 years old, Sacramento Valley rancher. He paid the highest price ever recorded for an enslaved person at public auction in California. He believed he had acquired something extraordinary. He just had no idea what. As Calloway's agent completed the paperwork, as the crowd dispersed into the Sacramento morning with the easy energy of men who have witnessed something they'll tell stories about, not one of them had thought to ask the question that would have stopped everything. They had not asked whether she was actually enslaved. They had not asked about the dress. Eliza Monroe walked off that platform into captivity that was not captivity, toward a plan that had been building for 8 years, inside a situation that she had never, not for one single day, actually lost control of. Calloway's house on our street was 2 stories, white-painted frame construction, a well-kept garden, the house of a man who expected Sacramento to know his name within a decade. He gave Eliza a room inside the main house. He had paid for refinement. He expected to have it. What he had, from the first evening, was something he could not categorize and therefore could not address. Eliza moved through that house with a specific kind of attention, the kind her father had described as reading the room before the room reads you. Within the first week she understood Calloway's schedule. Within 2 weeks she had identified the content and character of his correspondence, including correspondence with a San Francisco attorney named Edward Hart, who had handled cases under California's Fugitive Slave Act, and who Eliza correctly identified, through the nature of his letters, as a maze builder. A man who won through procedural confusion. A man who had never faced evidence. She also identified something else. Something that would matter. Preston Calloway had debts. Land speculation in the Sacramento Valley. Substantial, not yet public. The kind of debts that make a man simultaneously more aggressive and more fragile, because he cannot afford to absorb any additional financial shock without the entire architecture of his ambitions collapsing. She filed this information away. Then she looked for her channel out. The African Methodist Episcopal Church on K Street was the center of Sacramento's free black community, 200 people in a city of 10,000, organized with the precision of a community that has learned to survive through structure. The church's sexton, a man named William Booth, had spent the preceding year mapping illegal detentions and building a correspondence network with abolitionists in San Francisco, Ohio, and beyond. The housekeeper in Calloway's home was a free black woman named Delia. Eliza had assessed her in the first 3 days, watching the way she moved, the way her eyes processed information she chose not to voice, the way she maintained professional composure over something that read, to a careful observer, as deeply held moral attention. On the 4th day, in a single exchange during the preparation of a meal, lasting less than 30 seconds, Eliza communicated what Delia needed to know. Not everything. Enough. Within 24 hours the message had reached William Booth. Within 4 days, Booth had written to San Francisco, to a black attorney named Peter Anderson who had been searching, with the focused patience of a man who understands that timing is everything in law, for a case precise enough and documented enough to challenge California's Fugitive Slave Act before the Supreme Court. 3 words in Booth's letter. She has papers. Anderson understood immediately. Now, this is the moment I need you to really pay attention to. Because what happens next, what Eliza does over the following 43 days inside that house, is one of the most controlled, deliberate acts of strategic intelligence in this entire period of American history. And nobody recorded it properly. Because the people who would have recorded it were the people she was dismantling. Keep watching. On November 3rd, 20 days after the auction, Eliza Monroe passed the rolled linen sleeve to Delia during the preparation of the morning meal. No words. No change in expression. Delia walked to the K Street market that afternoon with the composure of a woman running an ordinary errand. She handed the sleeve to a contact. The contact delivered it to William Booth. Booth dispatched a courier to San Francisco on the evening coach. Peter Anderson received the document on November 5th. He read it once. Set it down. Read it again. He walked to his office window and stood there for a very long time, looking at the street below, at the city moving past in its ordinary California afternoon, entirely unaware of what he was holding. What he held was not merely one woman's freedom. What he held was a wall. A notarial certification issued in January 1849, 3 years before the auction, 3 years before California's Fugitive Slave Act, 3 years before any claim Harlan Foss had manufactured, recorded in a register that still existed, signed by a registrar who was still alive, bearing the legal authority of Orleans Parish and the state of Louisiana. Eliza Monroe had been free before any of this began. Every document Foss had filed was fraudulent against an antecedent legal fact that he had never found because he had never looked. Anderson wrote 4 letters that afternoon and sent a courier through the night. One to the Orleans Parish Notarial Office requesting certified confirmation. One to a federal judge in San Francisco. One to the Abolitionist Press. And one to William Booth. Tell her it is moving. Tell her to hold. She already knew. Preston Calloway received the first sign that something was wrong in the second week of November. A letter from his San Francisco attorney, Edward Hart. Brief in the way that professional men are brief when the news cannot be fully committed to paper. Questions have arisen regarding the provenance of a recent acquisition. Produce all documentation. Do not act until we speak. Calloway set the letter face down on his desk. He sat very still for a long time. The stillness of a man whose understanding of his own situation is undergoing a rapid, involuntary revision. Then he called for Eliza. She came into the study the way she had entered every room in that house. Unhurried, composed, eyes meeting his directly, with the patient steadiness of a woman who has been asked simpler versions of this question her entire life. He asked her directly, had she communicated with anyone? She looked at him for a moment. No, she said. She had communicated with no one. She was not lying in any sense that mattered to her. She had communicated with no one who was not already part of what was coming. Calloway studied her face. He was not a stupid man. He had built a freight company in a city that had been burning 2 years ago. He understood people. He prided himself on reading them. He found nothing in her face that helped him. He dismissed her. She walked back to her work. Harlan Foss, meanwhile, was in New Orleans. He had completed the Sacramento transaction months earlier and moved on to other business. He was sitting in his Poydras Street office, operating with the comfortable confidence of a man who has no reason to believe that anything in his recent past is anything other than concluded. He had no idea. Not yet. 20 days after Calloway received Hart's letter, a process server appeared at the front door of the house on our street at 10 in the morning. He presented Preston Calloway with a writ of habeas corpus, demanding that he produce Eliza Monroe before the Federal District Court in Sacramento on December 2nd and demonstrate the legal basis for her detention. Filed by one Peter Anderson, attorney at law. On behalf of one Eliza Monroe, free woman of color, citizen of Louisiana, wrongfully held in involuntary servitude within the state of California. Calloway stood in his doorway holding the document. The Sacramento Valley debts that had been sitting quietly in the background of his life suddenly felt very close. He telegraphed Hart within the hour. Hart's response arrived before evening. Retain local counsel. Do not speak with the woman. Do not move her. And pray that the Louisiana records do not say what I have been told they say. The Louisiana record said exactly what they said. I want you to think about something. Harlan Foss is still in New Orleans right now. He still doesn't know. He is going to find out, and the way he finds out is part of what makes this story what it is. Stay with me. The Federal District Courtroom in Sacramento was a converted commercial room on the ground floor of a brick building on 3rd Street. Plank floors. High windows. The pale winter light coming in at long, flat angles. The smell of wool and pine resin and institutional cold. It was packed to the walls. The word had moved through Sacramento's free black community through every channel available. The churches, the market networks, the invisible architecture of communication that a marginalized community builds when the official channels have been closed to them. Men and women who had no legal right to testify in any proceeding in this state. Who had no guaranteed right to even enter this building. Who lived every day inside the contradiction of a California that had declared their freedom in its constitution while constructing, piece by piece, the legal machinery to revoke it. They came anyway. They stood along the walls. They sat in the back rows. They were quiet in the way people are quiet when they understand they are witnessing something larger than the moment in front of them. Eliza Monroe entered the courtroom accompanied by Peter Anderson. She wore a different dress. Dark blue. Simple. She sat beside her attorney. She placed both hands flat on the table before her. She looked at the judge's bench with the expression she had been composing, in one form or another, since she was 16 years old, and a free document was in her hand for the first time. Anderson rose. He addressed the court with the unhurried, sequential precision of a man who has arranged irrefutable facts in their most powerful order. He laid out the chain. Virginia birth. Virginia manumission. New Orleans registration. Harlan Foss's manufactured documentation. The transport west. The auction. And then, through certified copies confirmed by the Orleans Parish Notarial Office, the document that had traveled 2,000 miles inside addresses Hem. January 9, 1849. Eliza Monroe. Free woman of color. Certified. Witnessed. Filed. Genuine. His legal argument was surgical. The California Fugitive Slave Act could apply only to persons enslaved at the moment of California's statehood. It could not, by any reasonable interpretation, by any legal standard, retroactively enslave a woman whose documented free status predated statehood by a year. The auction of October 14th had not been a transaction. It had been a kidnapping dressed in commercial language. A crime executed under cover of legal ambiguity. Calloway's attorney rose. He made his arguments with professional competence. Good faith. Accepted documentation. Contested legal terrain. The judge listened to both. He called a recess of 1 hour. The courtroom did not empty. The people standing along the walls did not move. The silence in that room was a specific kind of silence. The silence of people who have been told all their lives that the law does not see them, waiting to find out if today is different. The judge returned. He looked at the documents before him. He looked up. The court finds, he said, that the evidence of Eliza Monroe's free status is genuine, documented, legally antecedent to any claim made by any party in this proceeding. The California Fugitive Slave Act does not apply and cannot be made to apply to a woman whose freedom predated its passage by 3 years. Eliza Monroe is free. She has always been free. The room held its breath for one suspended moment. Then it did not hold it anymore. Eliza Monroe did not stand up immediately. She sat exactly where she had been sitting, hands still flat on the table, eyes on the judge's bench. And the expression on her face in that moment was not triumph. Not exactly, it was something older and quieter than triumph. It was the expression of a woman who placed a very specific bet 8 years ago, and maintained it through everything the world threw at her, and has just watched it pay. She had known on the auction platform. She had known in the desert. She had known on the day they took her, when she was already wearing the dress. She had always known. The proceedings that followed lasted 8 months. Harlan Foss was located in New Orleans in the spring of 1853. He had been conducting his business with uninterrupted confidence, entirely unaware that the transaction he had considered concluded was in the process of dismantling him. Federal marshals arrived at his Poydras Street office on a Tuesday morning, the same day of the week, by a coincidence that feels less like coincidence and more like symmetry, that Eliza Monroe had been taken from her rooms on Baron Street. He was returned to California. He was charged. He was tried. He was convicted on 4 counts of fraudulent misrepresentation and unlawful detention of a free person. He was sentenced to the California State Penitentiary. Preston Calloway contested his charges through the full extent of Edward Hart's legal capability. 6 days of jury deliberation. Guilty on the lesser counts. A substantial fine. And the Sacramento Valley land speculation debts, the ones Eliza had identified in his correspondence in the first weeks in that house, became public knowledge during the proceedings. The financial architecture Calloway had been carefully maintaining collapsed under the additional weight. Within 2 years he had sold his Sacramento holdings and returned to Georgia. A quieter man by every account than the one who had stood on J Street and bid on a woman whose freedom he never had any right to touch. The case reached the abolitionist press in Philadelphia and Boston and New York. Peter Anderson's legal arguments, refined and sharpened through the Monroe proceedings, formed part of the foundation on which California's fugitive slave law was allowed to lapse in 1855, when the legislature, facing a body of documented cases it could not argue around, declined to renew it. Anderson never received a monument. His name lives in the legal history of California, present but not amplified the way the names of people who do the actual structural work of justice so often are. The history of Eliza Monroe after 1853 thins into inference. Records place her in Sacramento through the spring, working with a legal aid network that had grown from the community infrastructure that supported her case. A letter in Ohio abolitionist archives from August 1853 references a woman named Monroe newly arrived from California, preparing to travel north. A Cincinnati directory entry from 1855 lists 1E Monroe, seamstress, Walnut Street. Whether these are the same woman, history does not confirm. What it confirms, absolutely without ambiguity, is what happened on J Street in October of 1852. A state that called itself free. A crowd of respectable men. A hammer falling. And a woman on a platform who had already won. There is something the historical record of this era consistently fails to capture. Not because it was hidden. Not because it did not operate in plain view. But because the system that produced those records could not see it without condemning itself. A system built on the legal fiction that certain human beings or property cannot simultaneously document those human beings' strategic brilliance, cannot record their patience, their calculation, their long horizon thinking, without producing a document that dismantles the system's own premise. And so the ledgers record the price. But not the calculation behind the eyes of the woman being priced. The court documents note the habeas corpus proceeding, but not the 16 years of a father's instruction that made it possible. The newspaper accounts describe the ruling, but not what it cost Eliza Monroe, in time, in controlled performance, in the sustained discipline of appearing to be something she was not, to arrive at the moment where the ruling could be delivered. History finds what it looks for. For too long, what it looked for in the lives of enslaved and formerly enslaved Black Americans was suffering. Documented, undeniable suffering. That suffering was real. Every syllable of it demands to be seen, named, and never reduced to background material for another story. But the suffering was never the whole story. The whole story includes a carpenter in Charlottesville, Virginia, sitting with his daughter by candlelight and teaching her to read legal documents, not for school, not for advancement, but because he understood that the difference between freedom and its revocation was often a single piece of paper, and that paper needed to survive. The whole story includes a 21-year-old woman in a notary's office in New Orleans, filing a document she hoped she would never need, and then going home and sewing it into the only thing she wore every day because she knew she would need it. The whole story includes the seamstress Delia, who passed a sleeve of waxed linen through a morning kitchen without changing her expression. The sexton William Booth, who had built a network for exactly this kind of moment. The people who stood along the walls of a courtroom where the law did not recognize their voice, and came anyway because witness is a form of power even when the law refuses to acknowledge it. The whole story includes the price. $1,400. The highest ever paid. And not 1 cent of it, not a single cent, ever purchased what the men standing on J Street believed it purchased. Because what they believed they were buying had never been for sale. You are watching Unmarked History. This channel exists because the most important stories in this country's history are precisely the ones that someone decided should not be told. The ones buried in notarial registers. Filed in offices that were later burned. Carried across deserts inside the hems of dresses by women who understood the law better than the men who tried to use it against them. If this story reached you, if it found you wherever you are and reminded you that intelligence, dignity, and strategy survived everything that was done to destroy them, subscribe. Leave a comment below. Tell me what city, what country, what corner of the world you're watching from. These stories are meant to travel. They have been waiting a long time to travel. History's most dangerous chapters are always the ones someone tried to bury. Unmarked History is here to dig.